Hello and welcome to Fintech Insider Insights. I'm David Barton-Grimley, Fintech Strategy Director right here at 11FS. In this episode, we are discussing digital identity. On an episode of Fintech Insider After Dark released earlier this year, we played out a video produced by Starling Bank warning of the real dangers of identity fraud. In the video, well-known actor James Nesbitt was played various voice clips of himself and had to work out which were actually of him and which had been generated by AI. And as amusing as it was for us and the audience to see James get the answers completely wrong over and over again, it threw up loads of interesting questions and debate around the current state of identity and being able to prove you are actually you. Financial services has a big fraud problem. Increasingly, we're covering it here on this show. And the stats back it up too. So what's the solution? Many think a universal form of digital identity could be it, or at least a big part of it. But that concept is not without controversy. And, that controversy varies depending on where you are in the world. Which is why on this episode, we've assembled a panel of experts to dig deeper and find out more. So first up, we have a warm Fintech Insider welcome to the one and only Chris Skinner, best-selling author and CEO of The Finanser. Chris, how have you been?
Yeah, good. I've gone all out for Movember, so
love it.
Hence this stupid moustache, which my wife hates, but I'm going to keep it for the moment because it covers my identity.
Oh, brilliant. Love it. Yep. Love it. Good segue. And next up, we have a Fintech Insider debut for Ofer Friedman, Chief Business Development Officer at Authentics. Welcome to the show, Ofer. Can you tell us a little bit about Authentics and what you do?
Sure. So Authentics is actually one of the oldest companies in this field, the only one that actually comes from the automation of ID verification in airports and border control. Later moved to primarily fintech, but not only that. We are quite global, clients like Google, Payoneer, Uber, TikTok, etc. So we have kind of a global view of things. And I would say our expertise is in strong verification, obviously touching exactly the points you just raised.
Awesome. And it's just occurred to me as you said the name of your company back that Authentics is Authentics. It's just not something I got.
The
maybe.
Domain was already busy.
Yeah, there we go. It's there in the name. Awesome. Great to have you on board. And last but not least, it's another Fintech Insider debut for Leon Ifayemi, Director of Coalitions at CFIT, and that's the Center for Finance, Innovation and Technology. Leon, it's great to have you on the show. How are you and how are things at CFIT?
Thanks for having me. CFIT is doing well. We are in the midst of deploying our second coalition, which is all around digital verification for enhanced economic crime prevention. And we're thinking around defining what a company ID structure should look like, taking the sort of pre-existing work that's been done on digital identity for individuals and trying to extrapolate that over to entities for the first time. So exciting times for CFIT. I'm doing well, albeit that I have a cold. So bear with me as I go, talk through my nasally throat.
And what listeners also need to know is that I also have a cold. So we have at least half the panel with allergies. So if you hear some coughing and hacking, it's autumn here in London and in Europe. Brilliant, Leon. That sounds very interesting. It's great to have you on board. So
it's a different definition of hacking, David.
Yes. Chris, this is another amazing segue to the topic of the show. I love it. And actually, we're going to come to you first, Chris. So to kick off the show, let's talk about the current state of digital identity around the world. And as I said, Chris, let's come to you first. Could you give our listeners a bit of an overview of what you see digital identity is and how it works?
I mean, the basics of digital identity is it's a digital representation of you that you can trust and whoever you're dealing with can trust that you actually are who you say you are. And originally, going back over the last 3 decades, you'd talk about a username and password. But as things get more and more complicated and more digital, it's become a lot more than that. So now you have names, date of birth, passport numbers, driving license, biometric data, a fingerprint or a face scan. You even have quite a lot of banks saying, my voice is my password. And now that I've said that, you could call my bank and get access to my account. It's very complicated, though, because no one's cracked it. Everyone's been trying to work it out over the last 3 decades. And if I'm honest, it's pretty awful. The state of the system right now is that usernames and passwords are completely broken. Many of them are hacked. There's trillions of dollars of fraud taking place around the world. I saw a stat from ACI, I think it was, that reckons $40 billion of fraud in 2027 will be the likely state of the system. I think it's actually a lot more than that, because you have specific problems like authorized push payment fraud. And when we talk about fraud, there's a whole range of frauds that have been growing. So authorized push payment fraud is where you actually are duped into giving money to somebody and you don't realize that you're not giving it to the person you thought you were giving it to. It's a fake. And so deep fake is massive. Just in the UK, almost $500 million has been lost in that sort of fraud in 2022. And then you have card not present fraud, and that's over £500 million as well. So what we're really talking about is security and fraud and identity and trust. And eventually, what I think everyone is now discussing is smart contracts and blockchain technology can crack some of these things. But in my view, it has to go a lot further than that. It comes down to who controls my identity. Is it me? Is it the government, or is it the bank, or is it someone else? And the answer should be it's me, which is where a lot of the technologists are driving towards using blockchain technologies. The problem with that, and I can see Ofer is shaking his head, is because maybe I'm not capable of controlling my identity. So, and equally, how is it backed up, and how can it be recovered if someone uses it incorrectly or breaks into it?
Well, you've led in quite nicely, Chris, with Ofer's head shake. And I think it would be good to come to you. I mean, what are the different types of authorities, Ofer, that could potentially, quote unquote, own this? So Chris was describing a more decentralized view. What are some of the other options?
Look, we are at the forefront of it. We are a company that actually does it. And we meet those fakes and those ideas, all kinds of them, on a daily basis. And I think that Chris was gentle. We are in a seismic shift here in the market of identity, of fraud, and of trust. Okay? When we started doing it, you had to show your ID, then you had to show your face with it. Then Chris said, but someone can be actually you right now. And then your ID is not going to be your plastic thing or your paper thing anymore. It's going to be on your mobile. And when it's going to be on your mobile, it's going to be encrypted. So since Chris said, let me rephrase something about what Chris said. I actually checked, okay? In Darknet and other sources, right now, there are about 10 billion sets of ID data somewhere flying, being sold, and whatever.
Wow.
But on Earth, you have only 8.4 billion people. So there's more identity credentials stolen than people on Earth. That's basically because a lot of them are more than once out there. Now, this means that your data, your name, your surname, your ID number, the data itself is pretty much exposed. It's useless. So the whole idea of identity is shifting slowly into your thumb, usually, or your face, your biometrics, because that says it's you. And then the data is given or not given. So your biometrics is going to be your identity eventually, but all of it is actually sitting on your mobile. Okay. Now that device is actually open to other stuff. It's exposed. It can be attacked. So it's a huge mess.
Yeah.
Where basically the world is shifting into digital IDs. I just today happened to have done a presentation to management here only on the developments in identity and fraud for October. It was just a summary for October. There are a few dozens countries already announcing, advancing, launching, etc., digital ID schemes. Most of them don't talk to each other. The idea of universal ID is just an idea. It doesn't exist anymore. And when I actually track it, because I'm also responsible for the market intelligence, you can see countries that already announced it now beginning to talk about, okay, which standard exactly is it going to follow? How exactly is it going to talk to other identities? So Chris, from my point of view, was very gentle because right now I would define the situation as a primordial soup of good intentions, of a clear plan to move to digital without actually having the map. It's being drawn as we speak.
Yeah.
So in one word, it's still a mess.
There's another little point on that one, Ofer, which is I've just been writing about UK Finance's response to the Bank of England's payments outline proposal of the future, which is to build using blockchain technology, clearing and settlement systems and platforms. And one of the things that quite clearly came out of that is whatever they bet on today, it's probably not going to be the system they'll use tomorrow. And in particular, on top of that, it won't be interoperable with other systems around the world. And I think that's one of the big issues that's to do with everything to do with payments, value exchange, and identity, which is whatever we do today, and I said blockchain is maybe going to be it, what happens when content comes in? What happens if European Union goes one way and America goes another and the rest of the world chooses a different path, and if all the countries are different? I've been dealing with this particularly in the Nordic region for a long time, and they are actually quite a champion of digital identity with Bank ID. But if you go between VIPs and mobile pay and the other systems across Sweden, Denmark and Norway and Finland, none of their bank IDs are interoperable. They're getting there. But a single universal ID, I kind of don't see it. And if you did have it, how do you keep it secure? What happens when it's compromised?
Yeah. So it's clear that there's a huge problem here. Leon, come in.
I do have a question about whether we could sort of create an equivalent to an IBAN for IDs, whether that be on the individual level or the corporate level, that would take the local ID providers that are issued on a national basis and connect them across borders. The reason I say this is because I mean our coalition at the moment is working on creating company IDs, and I just want to touch on a couple of the points that were already raised. With respect to company IDs, there seems to be this inverse relationship between sovereignty and privacy, and this will apply naturally to individual IDs as well. On one side, we want every individual or representative of a business to be able to, with greater degrees of authority and sovereignty, deploy shared identity information from their mobile phone. But at the same time, that puts a greater obligation on that individual to maintain the data, to become liable for its accuracy and the sources of the data and all sorts of other bits. So what then happens is we defer that responsibility to a data aggregator, which is very synonymous with today's credit bureau market. But you perhaps do so at the expense of your privacy. So I think from a technical deployment perspective, the market is trying to think about how it resolves that, finds equilibrium between sovereignty, i.e. how do we equip people with the tools to share data about their own identities and the identities of the companies that they represent, and privacy, i.e. to what extent are we reliant on a third party to do that? Because as individuals, that requirement is a heavy burden to carry. And until we find that, I think we'll continue to experience the problems that we do today. The other thing then is just going back to that original point is, once we've overcome that hurdle, how do we reconcile the identities that we've issued across national boundaries? And I know that the likes of Glyph, who issue LEIs, for example, are thinking that their LEI framework could be a way of connecting companies, at the very least, who have multiple entities across boundaries together. And I think it could be a potential solution. Perhaps there's some scope to extrapolate that concept to individuals as well, but there may not be a requirement because you can't have one person in 5 different places. keen to hear your thoughts.
There's so many angles to it that I'm kind of looking for the juiciest one.
Yes.
So, first of all, there is a kind of, or developing a kind of interoperable identity channel, which is basically the big players like Apple and Google, etc. Because what now looks like happening is who says you have only one identity wallet or in your pocket or in your device. You probably will have your state one, but many people already use the Google one or any, doesn't matter, any other commercial one. Okay. Now there's a third layer here, or those who try to hide from the first and the second one and do those wallets on blockchain for normally gaming or gambling, or let's say more borderline types of. So I expect people to be holding in their digital wallet more than one identity credential. And right now, out of all of them that you can find out there, the Apple one and the Google one are actually quite international. They should be accepted everywhere, but not for the same purposes.
Yes.
Okay, so you can expect to have a kind of Rolodex on your device.
Yeah.
Doing that.
Yeah.
And by the way, Leon, we are kind of talking about identity as it used to be. Your details on the identity document, etc. Because if I now moved to my phone, I have my identity, but also my phone has an identity, right? It has a unique identifier. Then when I'll go on, I'm working in a company and so I'm an employee of a company which also has an identity. And the whole idea of identity, once you get it also into IOTs, etc., is so sporadic that for Chris, it's another book to write about. Your identity follows you in every shape or form and device you can think about because it knows it's you, where you are, and what you're doing.
So you've all been flagging individually, quite rightly, that there are all sorts of different types of digital ID, right? There is no one single type of identifiable information which is like holistic. They're all very different. There's commercial types, there's government types. And then we've been talking a lot about decentralization so far. I'd love to talk a little bit about some of the more state-run initiatives and where some of the rationale comes from and maybe some of the benefits to do sort of centralized sovereign identity. So I think maybe it's right to say, and you can challenge me, that one of the canonical examples is in India. You've got the Aadhaar system. India's, one of the biggest countries in the world. It's issued something like 1.3 billion identity cards. It's run by the government. It offers a range of identification capabilities. So, it's not just the ID card, but it actually facilitates a bit of an economy that sits around it. I mean, Leon, maybe coming to you first, what would you say are the arguments for centralizing and how is the UK maybe thinking about it?
So I will talk about everything I'll talk about in the context of companies, because again, that's where we've done a lot of the work. But I think a lot of the learnings are comparable to, and the sort of sentiments are comparable to what you'll get in the personal ID world as well. The first thing is trust. And trust can go one way or the other, right? Ofer made a really interesting comment around Google and Apple prior. But I suppose if you took a bit of a referendum on public opinion to look at the levels of trust that between private institutions like the big techs and government, I would suggest that most people would defer to government in terms of the use of that data. And so one of the arguments for going down the centralized route is that governments have fewer incentives to misuse the data, are more likely to use it in a way that it has societal benefit. The second reason it is useful is that it reduces the the challenges that you get when you give the market optionality. Too much choice can be a challenge for deployment. It often can make it technically unfeasible for providers to come in and create a competitive market that is robust and where consumers are equipped with enough knowledge and information that they can make informed decisions about which wallet provider or ID provider they want to go with. So, with that in mind, some part of the argument is that by having this issued by government, you not only have one place through which the education piece can come to fruition, and government will deploy what it needs to inform consumers about the benefits of using a company ID, whether that be in quicker and greater access to financial services, but also they have one place to turn when things go wrong, and one organization to hold accountable for the outcomes that are driven by national use of IDs, whether that be at the company level or at an individual level. You can resolve that in a more decentralized space by having liability frameworks, but I think industry has had an incredibly difficult challenge in agreeing on what the liability obligations they would take on should be, such that the provision of IDs, again, whether that be company IDs or individual IDs, becomes a reality. And of course, with government, that isn't a problem, that a hurdle that needs to be faced. You've only got one party that's liable for all outcomes.
Ofer, one party, one centralized party. What are the benefits of it from a personal ID point of view? I've got some head shakes from Chris. We'll come to you in a minute.
Yeah, that's the wet dream of governments. That's the whole idea.
One of the many.
That's what. Yeah, I mean, your identity,
yes,
owning it or holding it or approving it is basically one of the elements of a sovereignty. That's what countries, states do. Okay, and in a way, you see now states trying to take back control over it after it was kind of starting to be shared with others. But they sell it in a nice way. I think that Leon mentioned self-sovereign identity, as if you are actually controlling your identity. Mind you, the identity credential you got from the state is there. They have a key, okay? The one you gave Apple or Google or whoever it will be, they have a key. Companies are issuing their own wallets, they have a key. So the idea of self-sovereignty means that, yes, at that certain point in time, you'll be saying it's okay to give that information. By the way, exactly as you did for search engines and other purposes. But the key to your identity, to saying it's actually you, is not yours.
Yeah,
it's asymmetric. You're holding one key, but the other one, they still hold. So it's not that now you are the master of your castle in terms of your ID. No, it's not happening like that.
Absolutely. I mean, and Chris, a final word on maybe the dystopian side of this. I know you wrote a blog post about this recently, which talk about some of the rather alarming ways that government can be tracking you and knowing about you. Yeah, I'd love to give you a final word before we move on.
Yeah, I think what we haven't touched on is it's a matter of scale, and there's commercial and personal identification. SWIFT, for example, as a network for a long time has tried to work on corporate identification systems to avoid politically exposed persons and failed. No one's cracked that nut, for example, which is why there's $3 trillion worth of money laundering going through their network every year. Equally, when you bring it to a personal level, I argued 15 years ago, it must have been, for four-factor authentication, which is something you have, like a mobile device or a card, something that you know, your PIN or passcodes, something you are, which is your biometrics, your face or your eyeball, or finger, and or DNA, because I'd love to spit on my bank, and then something that is where you are, because we can now identify exactly where you are and what you're doing. And I think the issue right now is that we don't need all that authentication, verification, identification for a contactless payment, for packet of bubble gum in a local grocery store. But if I'm transferring $25,000 or $250,000 or $2.5 million, is this subject to authorized push payment fraud, or is it CEO fraud where someone's duping an employee? How can you guarantee that those are safe transactions being done correctly by the individual to the individual it should be sent to, whether it's an individual corporation or an individual person? And this is this myriad of identities. And I think what we end up with is what's annoying me a lot right now is the number of times that I have to call the bank or go through different hoops with different providers. And particularly now we're in open banking, so I might be using one provider like Wise that then has to connect with my bank, and they both want me to identify myself and go through different processes. And open banking isn't meant to be that way. It's meant to take the friction away. Instead, it's increased it. So I think if you're looking at a vision of where we will go, then it will get to a stage where it will be self-sovereign identities, but it will be in different personas, some of which will be controlled by institutions and governments, but no one will have my complete identity file except me.
Chris, there's a very interesting point. And on that note, we're going to take a quick pause before we dive into what this might all mean for financial services specifically. It's all coming up after this super quick break, so don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Fintech Insider Insights, where we're talking about digital identities. So in the first half of the show, we spoke about digital identities, what they are, and some of the concerns around them. We have many. So in this second half, we want to discuss how banks might use it to help fight fraud, but also any other benefits it might bring to financial institutions. So just before we went to the break, we were talking, I mean, Chris, you were beginning to touch on the fact that just because you have maybe some nice new shiny tech ways of authenticating a person, it doesn't necessarily mean to say that the bank will trust an identity provider, and therefore as a result of that you've got lots of new tech, but it doesn't stop you from having to be authenticated again and again and again and again. Ofer, I want to come to you maybe first on this. Like, what is the problem with banks trusting digital identity sources? Would it ever be the case? Is it even permissible maybe that a financial institution can actually just say, fine, yep, we trust the source of that information. That's fine, we can accept it. We don't need to re-authenticate you every time.
First of all, they do need to re-authenticate you, but it won't be that painful. That's the whole idea.
Yes. Yeah.
Secondly, I want to add a little bit of salt into this stew, because we've been talking about how you identify yourself formally to an institution. An ID document, a document inside a smartphone or whatever. I remind you that only recently you probably read in the news that a couple of banks and other financial institutions have transmitted millions, I believe, in dollars to the voice of someone or to the face of someone without the need of that credential. I think the threat here, or the issue here, is not just how safe is your identity on your mobile, but the many ways someone can actually be you. I'm talking about obviously deepfake and generative AI, and about the injection element in it. So banks will trust, obviously, what the state gave you. What's the alternative? They may also use some interbanking type of like open banking or whatever, but that's what they have. Yet, when the conversation will be done and you will say, please transfer $25 million to my account here and there, it probably will look like this call. Okay? And I actually have examples using today's technology, which is imagined. It's not so well cooked yet. But if you are professional fraudsters, it will be my picture, it will be my voice. I can give you details that probably obtained from my profiles, and there will be no reason to suspect that it's not me. So it's not just the identity in terms of what you present to the bank. It's how you will be communicating with the bank. So I'm a little bit disrupting what you're saying, because eventually the facility you're using is the facility that everyone will be using. If it's a bank, probably the state, whatever, at least. But that won't be enough.
Yeah. But it sounds, I mean, listening to you talk, it sounds a little bit like an arms race, doesn't it? As the more technology picks up, the less trust there actually is inside the system. So the more optionality there is, the worse it gets in some cases. The higher the risk of fraud, the higher the risk of fines and penalties that banks face. Therefore, the worse the trust gets. I mean, I've actually experienced some of this as well, just as a consumer, some of the examples you were saying, Chris. The need to re-authenticate on open banking, for example, has just started to happen absolutely everywhere. As you say, that wasn't the point behind it.
I mean, there's a number of things in that, David, in that I remember the global head of fraud for HSBC presented at my networking group in London. This was over 10 years ago, and said there's an acceptable rate of fraud. And as long as we're below that percentage, then we're comfortable. If we're above that percentage, then we're not. And I think what's happening is the criminal community is using the network to increase fraud. I just saw a survey of 1,200 fraud professionals in banks, and 96% of them say their number one concern is the industrialization of fraud using generative AI, machine learning, deep fakes, etc. And that a third of them believe that AI will generate fake identity documents, and synthetic identities will become a tsunami of fraud over the next 3 or 4 years. And one of the questions was, when you think about fraud risk in the organization, what keeps you awake at night? And 39% said it's the lack of regulations and controls and the difficulty of verifying identities. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really interesting numbers, because what it says is we're not on top of this problem anymore. Going back to the global head of fraud at HSBC, 10, 12 years ago, an acceptable rate of fraud, because they were on top of it. There wasn't a huge amount of online banking, mobile banking. In fact, mobile banking was only just coming into the fray back then. Today, there are so many ways to get into the network and to hack and get money out of the network and to provide fraudulent identity details. It's horrendous. I mean, the solution is that there has to be obviously some regulatory structure, but how do you regulate a global phenomenon? It's a bit like, how do you regulate cryptocurrencies when they don't recognize country borders and national networks?
Indeed. And, how do you make it then interoperable, to the conversation before? Leon, what are your reflections on the B2B side of things? I mean, how does this contrast to your world?
Well, I think, one of the things that's going to make this work is to have some sort of trust framework that we could have a supplementary scheme that's an extension of the DCIT trust framework on individuals that would give the industry some comfort that when a business is engaging in some sort of KYB or onboarding process, that the company ID providers who are issuing the identity documents are compliant with certain standards that the bank is comfortable with. And that goes back to your question, what would be required to incentivize a bank or a receiving institution and get them to a level of comfort that they would want to receive those documents. So I think the trust framework is a piece. Chris talked about regulation, and we're working with the FCA to give their blessing to some of the amendments that we'd like to make to the DCIT framework to accommodate and build out on this supplementary scheme. The other thing really, I think, is in banks and financial service institutions having a mutual understanding of what an identity is, and number two, having a agreement on a common minimum denominator of data sets that are required to get through a set number of use cases. If, for example, we agreed that for KYB or onboarding use case, you needed these elements, you could build standards around the provisions of those data points only, and company ID providers could work on building more robust infrastructures and systems around those data sets to begin with. You would then have, on top of that, an infinite list of data points that banks could use at their own discretion to support additional use cases based on their own risk profiles. But at least that minimum common denominator of data points that have to be touched on would be addressed. The only point that I think is slightly that's interesting is that, and this goes back to our previous question on government involvement, is that a lot of the underlying data sources that feed into an overarching company ID framework or individual ID framework come from government, and there is no alternative for those underlying data sources. The challenge at the moment is that there's a reliance on the individual, or in my case, most of these cases I deal with, or in the company to self-certify their identity. So someone will go to Companies House in the case of an organization, download the documents pertaining to the individual directors, and provide that to a bank and say, hey, here's who I am. That process, in fact, and before that, they'll often need to get certification from an accountant or a lawyer to say that those documents are true. That process is highly susceptible to bad actors who, as Chris has already mentioned, can use AI to falsify those documents. And what we see is a world in which the space for interception by bad actors is shrunk by collecting data directly from the issuers of those documents, all those data points, into a company ID framework that meets this overarching standard, and then from that company ID provider directly into the bank. So you don't have those points of intervention, falsification that we've discussed so far. The only point that you could then sort of think about is, well, would bad actors then go to the source and try to create some sort of issues with the information quality there? If, for example, company ID providers were drawing information from Companies House and HMRC and identity documents from a number of additional places, would they create fake accounts on Companies House itself such that the information drawn out of their repository was fake? So, I don't think that the provision of IDs will solve the entirety of the problem, but they do take care of the current point of intervention that bad actors tend to capitalize on in today's world. And I think if we work with the underlying data suppliers to create an additional set of circumventions there, then I think we can get closer to a world where company IDs are actually deployed and where banks and other FS providers would be comfortable working with them.
I think there's an interesting point you almost touched on, Leon, but didn't go down that rabbit hole, but I'm going to go there, which is in an open banking world where you've got multiple providers involved in the value chain of delivering the user experience, whether that be corporate or citizen, you end up with multiple ways to get some compromise of that system. And I think it was best illustrated by Synapse Bank and Evolve Bank and Trust in the USA, where a data breach brought down the partner because the trust disappeared in that system. And I find it interesting that, in the open banking world that we live in the UK, and we innovated and have probably been the leader in that space, I still don't know whether we have a clear structure around what happens when you get a data breach in one of the parts of the supply chain. How do you deal with it?
Well, in my mind, there's got to be a liability framework, and that's something that we want to explore in one of the working groups that will come in post this coalition that we're in now. But the emerging thought process amongst all 70 of our partners, which does comprise of regulators, industry partners, and so on, is that the liability would sit with the company ID provider, who's obligated to meet the requirements of the trust framework the trust framework, but also the regulatory requirements as well. They would be, but they are only liable for collecting the data as an accurate reflection of the underlying data source. So if I, for example, let's call myself company ID provider 1, and one of my underlying data sources is Companies House, my only obligation is to take data from Companies House accurately and share that with the company ID provider. I don't have an obligation on making sure that Companies House data as an underlying data source in and of itself is accurate. And so there are multiple layers of liability that I think go from the bank, who then needs to take that data and doesn't have an obligation over the the quality of the data, but has an obligation and liability for how it's used in making certain decisions. And then the final sort of the foundational layer is the underlying data source, who would be a company's house or a HMRC or a credit bureau, who as a data provider into this company ID or individual ID would have the liability for the actual accuracy of the underlying data points that they're providing into this central tool.
And if that liability hasn't yet been defined, which it sounds from what you're saying, Leon, is it's absolutely key to these sovereign systems working and for financial institutions to actually trust them. Is anyone, this is a question for the panel, seeing any national sovereign digital ID systems which have solved some of these problems? I mean, I mentioned Aadhaar in India, for example. I know, Estonia has a very famous digital national ID, and several others. Singapore, I know Dubai has introduced it or is doing it. Is there any success stories that we can point to? Ofer, you're shaking your head.
No, it just I don't know if it was a Supreme Court or another court in India just ruled that you can't use Aadhaar in order to verify your age.
Gosh.
So the fact that you have that facility doesn't mean it's actually working. I don't know what Chris knows, but I'm having difficulty in establishing a system that works fine. Let's say usually relatively foolproof. The only ones I can say is that in the Nordics, because they have a system that's already working for years, prevalently used and well trusted, it looks like the most cooked one. The others are pretty much experimental. I'm following Australia, for instance, what they started doing with New South Wales and then all the rest of it. And you can still see questions asked about how exactly to do that, what standard to follow. So we are talking about a pre-cooked situation here. And by the way, talking about companies, it's so easy to establish a company and to build a record on one hand in markets that we usually are used to deal with, while in many countries, I mean, we are also doing KYB. So you need to come up with those credentials or to check the company itself. In many markets, it's not that available.
Yeah.
And it might be that actually verifying the company would be via the UBOs more than the data you have on the company.
And I think the issue fundamentally is that when you ask where's their success, is there isn't any that I could point to. We can look at Aadhaar, but I've got a lot of people that are friends of mine across India who say it's a way for the government to track and trace what people are doing, and they don't like it. But I would say that is the most successful one that I've seen. It's interesting, China's just launched a brand new national digital identity scheme. And again, they think it's a way that their government is going to monitor and track and trace what you're doing. I remember going to Sweden, and they had this system where you could have an NFC chip planted in your body, and you could travel around Sweden without ever having to pay, apart from using an NFC chip. But it was made available to everybody, but only a few thousand people got one, because everyone thought that it would be a way for the government to track and trace what they're doing. I remember going to Hungary and to Romania and other countries and talking about national identity schemes and digital identity schemes. And I said, oh, we used to have identity schemes. We don't like them very much.
Yes, I imagine this comes back to some of the cultural sort of dissonances and differences that we've been talking about. I mean, maybe as a kind of a final word might be to reflect on the US and the UK specifically. And those are two very, very different markets. I mean, one of the things about the US is it's a federal system, right? So some states, you've got Louisiana, for example, have made progress with digital driving licenses. I mean, I know that's not a proper digital ID, but it takes, it's a pretty good step towards it, and certainly better than maybe we have in the UK. And then in the UK, I mean, for listeners who are not aware, it's an extremely controversial topic, both politically, culturally, historically. Does anyone see a digital ID introduced in either of those two countries in, say, the next 5 years?
You could say we already have one. My brand new passport.
Yes.
And it's blue.
It has a chip.
And it's biometric.
Indeed.
We have moved towards better identification systems, but we haven't got better identity systems. Identification, a passport, fine, that's biometric, but identity is something that we just haven't cracked.
Yeah.
And I think we're still a long way from it. I don't know whether you guys would agree or disagree.
No, it's going to be kind of immersive. It's not just the data about you, which, by the way, reflects on the issue of privacy. Forget it. Won't happen. But as you mentioned about the US, I tend to believe it's kind of a preview to the way the world is going to work, because you already mentioned there are a couple of states accepting that have their own wallets alongside the Apples and the Googles. So right now, as it looks, and also voices I heard in Europe, is that your device is going to have a Rolodex. So, I mean, few people will have only one, probably older people, but the younger people, I mean, for things you don't want to be seen, you'd probably look for some...
What's a Rolodex, Ofer?
Sorry?
What's a Rolodex? I've never heard of that.
The accordion full of...
He's still got one on his table, does Chris?
So, I think Chris mentioned the issue of culture or society or the psychological element of it. People will prefer not to be identified by only one, and probably to divide methods or sources of identification by where you actually are dealing with. So for the elections, you use the government. For whatever, your bank, you might also use the government. To buy crypto, you might want some blockchain, Web3, self-sovereign type of wallet. So remind me to bring you a picture of a Rolodex, Chris.
I think that there's also another piece in here which we haven't touched on in terms of generative AI improving identification as well. In that, in one of my presentation decks, I have a slide of Liam Neeson saying, "I know who you are, I know where you are, I know what you're doing. I'm going to serve you better." And it's all about the fact that if we have that knowledge of the customer, shouldn't we turn it around and say, rather than trying to say we don't trust you and who you are, we should say we automatically can work out who you are and trust you so we can serve you better.
Yeah. I mean, that's another area we haven't been talking about so much, which is the customer need, right?
Chris, Google has been making the same claims. Now we are at 2025 almost. I think people kind of doubt that it's purely just to give you the best possible personal service?
So, in the interest of time, because this is an amazing conversation, we can go on forever. We're going to need to wrap very soon. So, Leon, I want to give you the final word. What's your view?
I'm optimistic, which I know Ofer and Chris might not necessarily agree with, but I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic, provided, however, that the method of deployment is correct and aligned with end consumer and company behaviors and expectations. And there are a couple of key sort of variables that we have to consider. The first is that, to both Chris and Ofer's point, is that a government centralized solution may not necessarily work because of the optics around it. And this general sentiment that I, as an individual, am being tracked, observed, and I don't like that sense of state-run control over my life and influence and oversight over my life. So perhaps the deployment of company IDs via the likes of Apple and Google, which are sexier companies whom we give our data to on a daily basis. I mean, I use my Apple Wallet, my Apple Pay every single time I tap on my to get a train, or when I'm buying a beer at the local shop, and I don't question the data that Apple is taking about me on it. But the moment you put the same sort of infrastructural, you take that and you put it in a governmental context, your skepticism goes up. And I don't know why that is. I'm not a behavioral scientist, but there must be a reason why that occurs. And I think we can forego that by working with tech companies that people inherently trust for whatever reason. The second is that when we brought up the question around AI, and I think AI is massively interesting, but an interesting stat that came out of the Alan Turing Institute is that when surveyed around what would be required to get people to a level of comfort around mass adoption of AI and emerging technologies, the major thing that people raised was, number one, is the provision of this service or technology going to be regulated and overseen with standards or by some sort of government-led body, not deployed by that body, but overseen by? And number two, can I turn to somebody else if something goes wrong? So if an AI makes a decision about something, or if I use a digital ID and something goes wrong, who do I turn to that is a human and has my interest at heart to help me resolve that particular instance of a negative outcome? And I think if we can resolve those two elements, I equally believe that we can get to a world in which digital IDs for both individuals and companies are become a reality.
I'm just going to ask Leon a quick question. What's Apple's phone number?
I don't know. I've never had to call them.
What's Google's customer service line?
I don't know.
Well, good question. Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, these are organizations that are not immediately available in the way that we need to, and yet, to Leon's point, and yet we trust them. And Ofer and Chris, you made the same point.
We do.
Yeah, we absolutely do. And, trusted Facebook and Meta and all of those things with all sorts of, personally identifiable information and various drunken photos of me over the years. It's so interesting. Leon, as you say, the fallback really comes down to just people speaking to people. Humans want to speak to humans. And sometimes it's a case of the more tech things become, the more analog people
David,
need.
what's Apple's phone number?
0800 0800 Apple. Give me a free phone. And on that note, everyone, that wraps up today's discussion. Thanks to the three of you for joining me. Where can people find out about all of you? Chris, go for it.
I'm pretty well known everywhere, but thefinanser.com is my daily blog. And you can also find me on LinkedIn, X, and various other places like Meta.
Amazing. Ofer.
I'm hardly as known as Chris. Maybe when I grow up. But I'm basically at Authentics, AU10TIX, and also because of the insatiable interest in it, also having a blog on deepfake and the future of it, which means basically talk to me about already rise of the machines. That's what's happening. So Authentics.
Nice. Awesome. And Leon?
I don't have all these. I don't have as many perhaps spaces in which I can disseminate information. I'm on LinkedIn, Leon Ifayemi. Please do check out our sites, the Center for Finance, Innovation and Technology, CFIT, CFIT.org.uk. We're publishing a blueprint next year around organizational IDs. We're defining that with all of our partners, and hopefully seeking to work with DCIT and the FCA and various others to define those trust frameworks and create the environment in which organizational IDs can become a reality. So watch this space.
Brilliant. And you can find me across various different deepfakes. I'm sure there are many. Prime character to deepfake me, I tell you. You can find me on LinkedIn at David VG. Thanks for listening, everyone. It's been a super interesting conversation. If you like what you've heard, follow our podcast and don't forget to leave us a review. It helps us to make it better and helps others to find the show. As always, if you want to join the conversation, find us on social media. Just search for 11FS or Fintech Insider or email podcasts@11fs.com. Thanks very much and goodbye.